They're not fit for purpose. I don't think they're capable of becoming fit for purpose. And I think that if Dutton loses, as he looks on track to, the next generation who will replace him in the Liberal leadership and in the Liberal shadow ministry are vacuous moderates. Gone are the days when a Liberal government would get in and make cuts or shift the needle back in the other direction. Now it's like, oh, okay, well, it's going to be managed decline. Trump is anti-elite. He is pro the forgotten blue-collar voter. And those people, I can guarantee you, exist here in Australia, and they are feeling voiceless. Both major parties are pandering to an inner-city elite laptop class base, and they're being advised by people who come from that class.
If the Libertarians are to be a legitimate alternative to the coalition, who's going to lead the way?
I think that I can use that platform to become that lightning rod, to become that leader for the fractured centre-right that we so desperately need.
Well, both major parties launched their campaigns for the 2025 election on Sunday, and the response from the public, it must be said, has been lukewarm at best. Neither side has pulled away with a decisive lead, and it looks like both sides are trying to focus on those parts of the Australian society that are least interested in politics, let alone working towards making this country as great as it used to be, to adapt a phrase which we will come to in a minute. But there is one party, well, there's a bunch of fringe parties on the centre-right that are offering decent alternatives, even though they are unlikely to form a government at this point. And one of them is the Libertarians. One of his Senate contenders or candidates is Jordan Dittloff, who's joining me from Victoria. Jordan, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Fred. This is an interview sometime in the making. You fled from me from your previous show, and you've had to reconstruct a studio and all those travails.
I built it just for you, just so we could.
Back on the airwaves.
Fantastic. Good to finally connect with you. Now, I have my opinions about what differences there are between Labor and the coalition. What do you still think that the options for the Australian public are essentially just two sides of the uni party, or are there fundamental differences between Labor and the coalition now that you've seen their campaigns launched?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it in the intro. I think that the overwhelming response of the voting public to the first 2 weeks of the campaign has been a resounding meh. And I think that look, I often think that politicians in Canberra don't give the voting public enough credit. And I think that they usually work it out pretty well and pretty quickly. And I think in this case, they've got it right. I think they've stopped listening to Peter Dutton. I think that they were hoping to get an alternative vision for the leadership of our country and an alternative to the one we've had for the last 3 years. And unfortunately, it seems that despite lots of opportunities to chart a different path and to be bolder and sort of seize on some of the elements that have helped see the success of movements like Reform in the UK and like Trump in 2024, Peter Dutton seems to be studiously avoiding anything that might distinguish himself from the Labor Party. See, I even nearly got the name wrong. The Laboural Party, that's what I like to call them.
The Laboural Party, very good. Yes, I'm going to borrow that.
Well, yeah, I've coined a few. I actually was the first to call the misinformation and disinformation bill the mad legislation. So I've come up with a few good zingers. So it bodes well for a potential Senate run.
Mate, imagine how well you'd perform in Parliament, given the.
I think not since the days of Keating will Hansard have had such a thrashing. If I get in, I'm going to be putting the cat amongst the pigeons for sure.
I have heard from inside the Liberal Party that they were keeping their powder dry until the launch of the campaign, so that they didn't announce any of their ideas or policies too early because they were worried that the Labor Party would steal them. Now, that seems absurd because they're meant to be coming from two different sides of the political spectrum. How can one side steal from the other if they're meant to be so different? They're not.
I mean, I think the bigger question, Fred, is that if you're running to govern the country in the best interest of Australians, wouldn't the best case scenario be that your political enemies adopt your policies?
Well,
I think that
there's much in what you say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I think
but
like because I should say I probably come at that from a bit of a biased perspective because it is the lot of the Libertarian Party over the last 23 years of our existence at nearly every federal election we've ever contested since our inception for the major parties to steal our policies. So you might have seen last year on the 18th of December before Christmas, we did a fuel stunt to showcase our fuel excise abolition policy that we want to get rid of the fuel excise 100% forever. And we got a 51% sort of I can't believe it's not butter version of that policy from Peter Dutton, where he's saying he's going to halve it for 12 months. So I think we're just used to other parties stealing our policy, and we think that's one of the reasons we exist. You know, if we have dragged the Liberal Party towards a slightly less shit version of themselves, then we are achieving an outsized result beyond even what we could hope to achieve if we held the balance of power sometimes. So
do you agree?
I think it's no bad thing necessarily for other parties to be copying your homework. But I think to answer your original question, I think that the risk with, if that is the Liberal Party's approach, and it sounds like something they would say, then I think the risk that did exist and has in fact materialised is that if you keep your powder dry for 2 weeks of an election, by the time you're ready to start talking about these big ticket things you want to talk about, the electorate has switched off and they're not paying attention anymore. And I think that's where Peter Dutton finds himself.
Well, it also signifies that you have this a kind of cynical attitude towards politics. I mean, anyone who aspires to be a politician should be enthusiastic, ebullient, and even champing at the bit to talk about policy at any stage of the electoral cycle, not just 3 weeks out from an election.
No,
you and I are from the right side of politics. How far short has Peter Dutton fallen from where he should be, in your opinion?
Look, I think honestly, Fred, particularly watching the leadership debate last week and watching the Treasurer's debate shortly afterwards, when I started my campaign 12 months ago, because I was endorsed about mid-April last year, so I've been campaigning for, more than 12 months at this point. So this isn't like a flash in the pan, I suppose I'll throw my hat in the ring. This is something I've devoted almost every waking second that I've had to spare to the campaign. I've been campaigning full time since I left my paid employment at the end of January. So I've made a lot of sacrifices to run. And for most of that campaign, I think in my mind, I was working on the goal of making the Liberal Party better. That if we can get a Senate seat here in Victoria, maybe in New South Wales with Craig Kelly in the joint ticket, then we can drag the Liberal Party towards a better version of itself that Menzies might have recognised and make it act more in accordance with its principles. But at some point last week, I honestly found myself reflecting on that goal and on the performance and on what the Liberal Party has become. And honestly, now I think that they just need to be replaced. They're not fit for purpose. I don't think they're capable of becoming fit for purpose. And I think that if Dutton loses, as he looks on track to, the next generation who will replace him in the Liberal leadership and in the Liberal shadow ministry are vacuous moderates with no kind of connection to the Howard years, even to Tony Abbott, who I had a lot of issues with in different ways, but now I think have come to miss and think of quite fondly in comparison to what we've had, be it Morrison or Dutton. Dutton is the last of the old guard. Once he's gone, you have your Angus Taylors, your Susan Lays, and they are midgets in comparison to that previous memory of what the Liberal Party was. And I think that we really need to be, if we are successful at our bid to win Senate representation, we need to be starting the hard work over the next 3 years on day one, after those Senate seats are announced, to achieve lower house representation, to start to achieve the kind of movement like we've seen in the UK with Reform and others, because we just can't keep going like this. We can't keep just hoping that when the Liberal Party eventually fall across the line because people are sick of the Labor Party, that they're going to do less damage. And that's what the reality is. Gone are the days when a Liberal government would get in and make cuts or shift the needle back in the other direction. Now it's like, okay, well, it's going to be managed decline. And we see that in things like immigration policy and housing policy. Peter Dutton this week at the campaign launch said he wants managed increase in house prices. Like, how is that compatible with the dream of people my age and younger? I'm 38. And, people my age and younger feel like the dream of home ownership is completely outside their reach now. And he's saying he wants managed increase. And that's with inflation. It's insanity. The
If Robert
Libertarian Party are
Menzies,
the only. Yeah, sorry.
if Robert Menzies was alive today, which party would he join? Liberals or Libertarians?
I think he would call himself a libertarian because Robert Menzies' whole reason for creating the Liberal Party was because he could see that there were these two traditions in the minor right at that time in Australia. There was the conservative tradition and the classical liberal tradition, which, you could fairly say is very connected to the libertarian tradition. And the fusion of those two and the fact that they would work together and support each other mutually was what the Liberal Party was founded on. That idea of a broad church, the idea of those two traditions working together. And now, if you're a conservative in the Liberal Party, you're feeling very much like it's not a party that represents you. If you're a classical liberal or a libertarian in the Liberal Party, of which there are still many, and which I was for a number of years before I left the Liberal Party in 2014, you are looking at a party that is now filled with careerists, with populists, with moderates, who have much more in common with their supposed adversaries on the other side of the, on the other side of the parliament. And I just think that the Liberal Party has to almost come apart for there to be a real chance of representation and a voice for Australians who don't agree with the globalist agenda, who don't agree with tax and spend.
It's interesting that you bring up the globalist agenda. I mean, when you look around the world, we are facing the same fork in the road that most liberal democracies are. There are reactionary right-wing parties emerging all over the world. As you just mentioned, Reform, which are actually having their own troubles in Britain right now. But let's leave that aside. But of course, I mean, what these parties are a response to are essentially what Donald Trump called the deep state or the swamp. That swamp is as deep in Australia as it is in the US and the UK and France and Germany and Sweden and wherever else you want to look. The thing that baffles me right now, Jordan, is just how paranoid anyone on the right side of politics, well, should I say in the coalition, is how afraid they are to be even remotely associated with Donald Trump. Donald Trump speaks for ordinary people. He's popular for a reason. How popular do you think he is in Australia? You get out amongst the punters. What are you finding?
Yeah, well, look, if you listen to Patricia Kavelis and Kos Samaras and all those kind of, left-wing ABC Labor pollsters, and I quite like Kos, and a lot of his analysis is pretty on point. It's just the things he draws from that analysis I disagree with because they're very much informed by his politics. But I think that when the Australian mainstream political class and media look at Trump overseas, they're not understanding the real phenomenon of what Trump represents. Trump is anti-elite. He is pro the forgotten blue-collar voter. And those people, I can guarantee you, exist here in Australia and they are feeling voiceless. They are feeling like Labor has betrayed them, but they don't trust the Liberals and they're looking for another option. They're looking for that light on the hill, for someone to actually raise the banner and say, we are going to be your voice and represent you. And I'm speaking to those people every week.
Yeah, can you just elaborate on that? Because you are out on the hustings. What are you finding amongst Victorians? I mean, for a start, it's a rust bucket state, having been ground into dust by Dan Andrews and left with hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. But what's the feeling on the ground among ordinary Australians? How do they respond to your policies? For example, one of the key policies of the Libertarians is to reduce income tax, the
20% rate. Yeah.
Flat 20% rate and no tax for corporations.
So,
I mean,
what
sort of response do you get to that?
Well, look, I mean, fantastic, because the sort of people that we're meeting and talking to are tradies who are now small business owners. They are running a business. They're employing staff. They're driving vehicles that use petrol and diesel. They're using roads that are terrible. They're using, they're buying a case of beer at the end of the week when they've had a hard work week. They're buying increasingly black market cigarettes,
which is taxed to the hilt. I should add,
it's taxed to the hilt. I can guarantee you, fewer and fewer Victorians are paying for. This is a wonderful term. Voters, when they speak to me about cigarettes, they actually call legitimate taxed cigarettes government cigarettes versus black market cigarettes. How amazing is that? Like, that's amazing. And they're like, no, don't take away our black market cigarettes. We don't want to pay for government cigarettes. I'm like, This is like,
Wow,
if it weren't
wow,
for the fact
wow.
that the, Hamad family and the Turkish organized crime that run black market tobacco were very unlovely people, it would actually be the perfect libertarian situation. But,
Well, yes, yeah.
so we're talking to these people who are basically the classic Labor base once upon a time, the Howard Battlers, whatever you want to call them. These people increasingly feel like not only do both major parties not know who they are, they treat them with contempt. They don't want to know who they are. Both major parties are pandering to an inner city elite laptop class base, and they're being advised by people who come from that class. 83% of all jobs created in Australia in the last 12 months were government or government adjacent jobs, actual public service jobs, consultants, or NDIS. If that trend continues, which I'm sure it will, the average Australian will have a lot of vested interest in the continued growth of the deep state and that project of constant government expansion into private enterprise.
Yeah, by then it'll be a point of no return. Yeah. There's another point.
The beauty of this, and I just wanted to touch on this, is that the Libertarian Party, unlike the Liberal Party, our advantage is that I don't care what 51% of Australians think. I don't care. I'm looking for those Australians and those Victorians in particular who feel like their voice isn't being heard, who feel like they aren't being represented. I don't need them to be a majority. I just need them to be a constituency that I can represent and stand up and fight for. And for me to win a Senate seat in Victoria, I need to win about 4 to 5% of the primary vote and then get some benefit from preferences. And the higher my primary vote is, the better. But I don't need, even the sizable, large minority of Victorians to agree with our ideas. I need to find and fight for those people who feel like they're outsiders, who feel like they're not represented at the moment.
Are you finding them?
Yeah, we are increasingly. And I sent you before this started. I won't use the exact language, but it was a fantastic, random box pop that a friend of mine sent me. He's at a fly in, fly out mining site somewhere in regional New South Wales, and he sent me this message that he just spoke to someone who said that they were going to vote for us because we get it. And he used some other colourful language that said he was very favourable towards us. But, the average working class Australian.
Well, having seen that, sorry to interrupt, but having seen that colourful language, I can verify it's very authentic Australian as well.
It is. I wish I could put it on billboards.
You are getting the support from grassroots. I can guarantee that.
So once people find out about us and once we get that awareness and people realise we're there, our conversion rate to those people thinking that we represent them is quite high. So we are on the mission at the moment.
So are you finding, that's interesting, are you finding that when you meet people and you get a few minutes with them, you are able to bring them over easily?
Almost invariably, the people I speak with say some version of the following: "Oh, that sounds like common sense." And, it's funny because I sort of, and then there's this knowing laugh and they go, "Oh, I suppose it's not that common anymore." And I think Australians, there's a lot of stuff that's done in the name of this supposed majority. But I think Australians have a tendency to sort of just, sort of roll their eyes and get on with their life, and they're not necessarily going to fight the system or correct people. But people like my parents, I was raised that there's a difference between tolerance and promotion. That you basically stay in your lane, you work hard, render unto Caesar kind of thing. And I think that that's a big part of Australian culture. And so as a result, it's coded as apathy, and our political class pretty much gets away with a lot of stuff that they wouldn't in other countries because Australians just want to be left alone. And that's not necessarily in a libertarian way, but it does mean that when we can actually explain we want to create less government overreach, less government interference, we want them to be free to raise their kids according to their values, that gets very broad, cut through an appeal.
Well, Jordan, I got to say, the way you talk about these things is really articulate and insightful. And it's a shame that the major parties, no one from the major parties very few people from the major parties is speaking with the same eloquence that you are. In fact, both major parties tell their candidates at this crucial time of the electoral cycle not to say anything. Everything has to go through head office in case someone slips up, which is exactly the opposite of what democracy is meant to be. Now, let me throw something at you, which I think is the single most important issue in this election and is being roundly suppressed by the major parties, and that's immigration. What are you finding? What are people thinking about immigration on the ground?
Well, I think that for the everyday Australian, immigration is something that they're not sitting around thinking resentfully, geez, I wish we had less people from other countries in this country. That's not how people feel, and that's not the average Australian at all. What they're thinking is, if we're struggling to pay our mortgage, and if we're struggling to put petrol in our car and find somewhere to rent, or go to the supermarket and buy our groceries, and there's all these problems the government isn't fixing, why are they making it worse by pouring gasoline on the fire? That's how Australians feel. And you're seeing across the left and the right, you're seeing people who are Labor Party supporters going, hang on a second, how can it not be that university students coming to Australia don't take up rental space? Like, that's not possible. Why are we being sold this fiction? And why isn't it possible to take an approach to immigration that actually benefits the existing society? That's what Australians want. And they're being gaslit, and they're being told that to even raise those concerns is racist or wrong or, Nazi or whatever. And
well, you don't have to hear that.
Yeah, like my grandparents came from Germany after World War II. So the word Nazi gets bandied about to the point where it's meaningless. But my grandparents fled the consequences of an actual Nazi regime, and they came here to get away from that stuff. And
the accusations of racism and Nazism are perfectly meaningless these days. They've been thrashed so much that they've lost any meaning whatsoever. The conundrum that we're facing, of course, is that the swinging seats, if I can use an American term, the swinging seats in Australia are often populated largely by migrants. So if you do want to get that upper edge in the number of seats in the House of Reps, then you do have to pander to migrants. I mean, it's almost like we've reached a point of no return.
Maybe, but not necessarily. I think that if you talk to a lot of migrants to our country, and certainly a lot of migrants even within our party and people who are supportive of us and our ideas, everyone sort of wants to be the last migrant to arrive. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of people who are in migrant communities who are, first or second generation Indian migrants, for example, or Sri Lankan or Mauritian, or wherever they've arrived from, and they are just as dismayed at the way immigration policy is playing out. So I don't think it's true to say that even recently and first or second generation arrived migrant communities actually think that migration policy is being done well in this country or couldn't be improved. So again, I'd challenge that assumption, and I'd say that a policy like the Libertarians' immigration policy, where we're saying, it's not as simple as simply shutting off the tap and saying no migration for a period of time or whatever. We need to actually think about, what are we trying to achieve with our migration policy? We need to be delivering outcomes through migration that benefit the existing society, that select for people who are entrepreneurial, who want to come here to enjoy the benefits of living in our country, which is a great country, who want to come here for the things Australia has to offer, and who are in a position to support themselves, who have skills that are actually needed. The idea that the government can kind of like the octopus that picks the World Cup outcome every year in soccer, can sort of discern what the right skills gaps are, and how people are going to find jobs when they get here. Like, we've all had Uber drivers and taxi drivers who have degrees in applied physics and engineering and all this sort of stuff, but they haven't been able to find a job because the government is no better at doing that than it is at anything else it tries to do, which is about the proficiency of a very, very limited 5-year-old. So we believe that introducing a kind of a migration fee that is higher, that reflects the upfront cost that a new migrant coming to the country would incur on public infrastructure and public goods, is a fair way to determine the right mix and the right incentives to get the best migrants coming, and the right number to make sure that it's actually benefiting the existing society.
So what are your odds of getting a significant number of seats in the Senate?
So I think that for the Libertarian Party at this election, we've got some fantastic candidates in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and South Australia and WA. So we've got really good candidates. I think our best opportunities to win seats in the Senate are across the eastern seaboard in the bigger states, where we do have more branch infrastructure, more resources. Queensland is going to be a very tight race between Bon, Libertarians and Rennick. Maybe there's 2 seats in play that the minor right could pick up, but that is going to be a very crowded sky. In New South Wales, we've actually got a joint ticket between Gerard Rennick's People First, the Heart Party, and the Libertarians, with Craig Kelly at the top of that ticket. So even though New South Wales is a harder state to win the 6th Senate than Victoria, I do think Craig is in with a shot. And here in Victoria, that represents our best chance of winning a Senate seat, where Ralph Babbitt at the last federal election was able to win a seat with 4% and favourable preference flows. Now, I think that probably needs to be closer to 5% for me to be not stressed on election night. And we're probably not going to know on election night with the way the Senate gets counted. But I think that we have the best chance we've ever had. I think that a lot of people thought COVID was the time when people would really sort of rise up and see the consequences. But I think a lot of the consequences of COVID weren't felt in 2022. They've been felt in this 3 years since, and they will be in the next 3 years ahead as well. So, I don't know what our outcome is going to be on election night, but I do know that I'm not going to wake up on Sunday thinking there was anything more I could have done.
These revolutions, if I can use that word, from the right,
I'm quite happy for you to use that word.
Yeah, I mean, it's an appropriate word, but they tend to be led by single people. I mean, you've got Marine Le Pen in France, and you've got Farage in the UK and Donald Trump in the US. Who's going to lead the Libertarian? If the Libertarians are to be a legitimate alternative to the coalition, who's going to lead the way?
So I think that if I'm successful at winning this Senate seat on 3rd of May, and if I'm elected to the Senate, I think that I can use that platform to become that lightning rod, to become that leader for the fractured centre right that we so desperately need. I think that one of the problems we have in Australia is this kind of sense of tall poppy syndrome, the fact that our economic leaders like Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart, who could potentially be a sort of a Trump-like figure, don't necessarily have the same experience in politics and in showmanship. Trump is not just a business person, he's also an entertainer and a performer. He's got that ability to sort of traverse those two worlds. But I think Clive thinks that politics is the same as business, and that's always been his problem because it's not. But for me, I've had the political pedigree and the political apprenticeship of coming up through the Young Liberals, of learning, how to fundraise, how to campaign, and how to actually be an effective crossbencher if I'm elected. And I also know that unlike the major parties, I'm not running to make up the numbers. I'm not running to find 51% of people and mirror back to them what they think. I'm running to establish a platform to grow our movement and to basically put in the hard work for the next 3 years that we'll need to start on day one of the new Senate term if we're to win lower house seats and really challenge the status
Well,
quo.
in that way, you're very reminiscent of Farage in that way, because he just cut his teeth in town halls for decades, arguing and campaigning to get Britain out of the EU. And that was his apprenticeship. And it sounds like you're doing something similar. So,
Jordan, I think that people in Australia look at overseas and look at the examples of America and the America and the UK, and they want what they have right now. They want that to be the sort of thing we teleport to, because they can see it in real time. They can't understand why we can't just snap our fingers and have that. But the reality is it takes, sometimes as much as decades of grind, of hard work, of building genuine grassroots movements, not just at elections, but in between them. And that's what the Libertarian Party has, that I think makes it the best standard bearer for an alternative future going forward.
Jordan, what a joy it is to speak to you and hear such optimism and common sense from a prospective politician. Good luck in your run for the Senate. I hope to see you there on May the 4th.
Yes, thank you very much. May the 4th is Star Wars Day, so that's not lost on me. Hopefully we can start the rebellion.
Yeah, that's right. The Libertarians strike back.
Exactly.
Good on you, Jordan. Thanks for joining me.
Mate. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.